A short article appeared on the official website of the Society of St. Pius X on August 5, 2026. It carries no dramatic headline in the ordinary sense. It is not a press release. It is not a canonical filing. It is a commentary, a few hundred words long, signed by Father Alain Laurens. And on the surface, it looks like exactly what it is: one priest's reflection on a decree that has already been discussed at length. And yet this short piece contains a single observation that, once you actually sit with it, changes how the entire excommunication story reads. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that observation is, and I will leave you with 3 specific things worth watching in the weeks ahead to see whether it holds up. Father Laurens's title states his thesis plainly. Cardinal Fernandez holds the pen in the name of Popes Francis and Leo XIV. Not Cardinal Fernandez acted alone. Not Cardinal Fernandez overstepped his authority. Holds the pen in the name of the popes he serves. That specific framing is the entire argument of the piece, and it deserves to be examined carefully rather than either dismissed or accepted at face value. The facts that anchor the article are not in dispute. It was Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, who signed the July 2, 2026 decree declaring the excommunication of the consecrating and consecrated bishops of the Society of St. Pius X, and warning that the same penalty could extend to priests and faithful found to formally adhere to the schism. This is documented and confirmed. What Father Laurens adds is a specific biographical detail that most coverage of the decree has left out entirely. This is the same Fernandez who, years earlier, served as a principal drafter of texts for Pope Francis, and who is widely credited as one of the key authors behind Amoris Laetitia in 2016, the document whose footnote 351 opened the door, in the interpretation confirmed by Pope Francis himself to the Argentine bishops, to Holy Communion for some Catholics who are civilly remarried without an annulment while their prior sacramental marriage remains valid. Fernandez was later, under the same pontificate, closely associated with Fiducia Supplicans in 2023, which authorized non-liturgical blessings for same-sex couples. Father Laurens also recalls, and this is a matter of public record rather than allegation, that before receiving the cardinal's hat under Pope Francis, Fernandez published 2 earlier books, one titled Heal Me With Your Mouth, The Art of Kissing, and another concerning mystical passion, spirituality, and sensuality. These titles are real. They are publicly documented, and Fernandez has not to date issued any formal retraction of them. Father Laurens's own judgment of these specific works, that they represent a strange foundation from which to now sign a decree invoking strict doctrinal and moral rigor against others, is his personal assessment, offered pointedly and without much diplomatic softening. It is a serious editorial judgment, not a neutral fact, and it is fair to note that plenty of Catholics, including some sympathetic to Fernandez, would push back hard on how fairly those older works are being characterized here, or on whether they have any real bearing on the canonical validity of a 2026 decree. Here is where the article's real question comes into focus, and it is the question worth sitting with, regardless of how one feels about Fernandez personally. If the same dicastery, under the same pontifical direction, produced Amoris Laetitia's opening toward communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, and Fiducia Supplicans' provision for blessing same-sex couples, and now also produced the July 2nd decree applying the Church's most severe canonical penalty to bishops who consecrated successors without a papal mandate in order to preserve access to the traditional liturgy. What is the actual governing principle being applied consistently across all three documents? Father Lawrence's answer, offered as his own interpretation rather than an official finding, is that the operative principle is not settled doctrine applied evenly, but institutional loyalty to the current direction of church governance applied selectively. What he and others in this space have taken to calling the liquid magisterium of the synodal church, a phrase meant to suggest a governing framework flexible enough to authorize significant pastoral changes in one area while treating fidelity to a liturgical form used for over a millennium as the one thing that cannot be tolerated. That is a serious and contestable claim, and it deserves to be treated as exactly that, an argument being made by a priest of a community currently under canonical penalty, not as a neutral finding this channel is independently verifying. It is worth stating plainly that Cardinal Fernandez and his defenders would reject this characterization entirely and would argue that Amoris Laetitia, Fiducia Supplicans, and the SSPX decree rest on entirely distinct theological and canonical grounds that cannot fairly be reduced to a single unifying pattern. Father Lawrence closes his piece by inverting the meaning of the word excommunication itself. To be condemned today, he writes, by the same authorities who have authorized what the Church has historically considered irregular in other areas, is not necessarily evidence of guilt. It may instead function, in his reading, as a kind of negative confirmation of orthodoxy, being rejected by the same hand that has extended tolerance elsewhere. This is a rhetorical move worth naming clearly for what it is, not a canonical argument, but a theological reframing intended to give meaning and consolation to a community that has just been placed under the Church's most severe penalty. Whether that reframing is fair, self-serving, or somewhere in between, is something reasonable Catholics, including those sympathetic to tradition, can and do disagree about. So where does this actually leave things? Not with a verdict, but with three specific things worth watching. First, whether Cardinal Fernandez or the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith responds directly to this specific argument, the claim that the same authority behind Amoris Laetitia and Fiducia Supplicans is now the same authority applying maximum severity to liturgical tradition. A substantive response would engage the actual coherence question. Silence would leave the argument standing unanswered in Catholic media, regardless of its merits. Second, whether other canonists or theologians, including ones with no sympathy for the SSPX's own canonical position, take up the narrower and more answerable version of this question. Is there a consistent, publicly articulable standard being applied across recent doctrinal and disciplinary decisions from this dicastery, or does the pattern only make sense case by case? That is a legitimate theological question independent of what any SSPX priest says about it. Third, whether the biographical details Father Lawrence raises about Fernandez's earlier writings become part of the broader public conversation about his suitability for the office he holds, or whether they remain confined mostly to traditionalist media. That will say something about how seriously the wider Catholic press is willing to engage material that is uncomfortable regardless of its source. None of this settles whether Father Lawrence is right. It only tells you what to watch for to find out. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you. Before going further, it is worth returning to something raised in Part 1, and stating it more plainly. This video is built around one priest's published commentary and the specific argument he makes about consistency, or the lack of it, in how the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith has applied its authority across several major decisions. That argument deserves to be presented clearly and taken seriously. It does not deserve to be dressed up as settled fact, and it does not require exaggeration to be worth discussing. So Part 2 stays close to that same standard. The broader context Father Lawrence places around his central argument concerns what actually led the Society of St. Pius X to consecrate 4 bishops without a papal mandate on July 1st in the first place. His framing is that the bishops made this decision not in a vacuum, but inside a specific institutional climate, one in which, in his assessment, the current leadership of the relevant Vatican offices had shown no willingness to allow the traditional liturgy and its associated communities to expand, stabilize, or be treated as a normal and permanent part of Catholic life, rather than a tolerated exception subject to gradual reduction. Whether that reading of the institutional climate is accurate is itself contested. Cardinal Roche and others would argue the restrictions reflect a genuine and defensible concern for liturgical unity, rather than hostility toward tradition as such. But it is fair to say, as this channel has covered extensively in prior episodes, that the pattern of restriction, non-renewal of permissions, and administrative friction directed at traditional communities across multiple dioceses in recent years is documented and real, whatever explanation one gives for it. Father Lawrence's point, stripped of its more polemical framing, is this. The SPX bishops did not act with the expectation of a warm reception or an open door if they simply waited longer. They acted believing, rightly or wrongly, that the institutional trend was moving in one direction only, and that further patience would not produce a different outcome. That is a claim about their state of mind and their reading of the situation, not a claim this channel can independently verify. It is presented here as their own justification, which deserves to be represented accurately even by those who ultimately disagree with the conclusion they drew from it. From there, Father Lawrence's article and the broader commentary built around it in Spanish-language traditionalist media this past week extends into a considerably larger and more contested claim that the pattern of decisions from Rome, not just the SPX decree but the broader trajectory since the Second Vatican Council, reflects something more than a series of individually defensible pastoral judgments. Some commentary in this space goes further still and frames this trajectory as the result of deliberate ideological infiltration into church leadership, including specific references to alleged Masonic influence going back decades. That is a claim this channel is not in a position to verify, and it should not be repeated as though it were established. It belongs to a long-running and highly contested strand of traditionalist commentary with real historical antecedents in documented episodes like the Bugnini controversy. But the leap from those specific and disputed historical episodes to a claim of ongoing coordinated infiltration governing current Vatican appointments is a substantial one, and it is presented by its proponents as interpretation, not as something with the kind of evidentiary support that would let a responsible reporter. Viewers should weigh it accordingly. What is more defensible and worth engaging on its own terms is the narrower theological argument underneath all of this, the principle of lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer establishes the law of belief. This is not a fringe idea invented by traditionalist commentators. It is a genuinely ancient and widely accepted principle in Catholic theology, traceable to Prosper of Aquitaine in the 5th century, and it has been invoked across the theological spectrum, not only by defenders of the traditional Mass. The underlying claim is straightforward. How the Church prays, over time, shapes what her members actually come to believe and internalize, sometimes more powerfully than catechesis or formal doctrinal instruction does. A missal, a lectionary, a set of liturgical gestures and postures are not neutral containers for doctrine. They form the imagination and the instincts of the people who pray within them, generation after generation. This principle is genuinely why the liturgy question has never simply been a matter of aesthetic preference, incense versus no incense, Latin versus vernacular, ad orientem versus populum. Both defenders and critics of the post-conciliar liturgical reform have, at various points, invoked exactly this principle to make their case. Defenders of the reform have argued that the revised liturgy better expresses developed theological emphases on the participation of the baptized and on Scripture. Critics, including voices well outside the SPX specifically, have argued that significant changes in liturgical form inevitably carry theological weight and deserve to be examined with real seriousness rather than treated as administratively neutral adjustments. This channel has already covered, in a previous episode, Cardinal Roche's own public statements asserting that the theology of the Church has changed since the Council and that the traditional Mass no longer reflects it. That is Roche's own stated position, in his own words, not an inference imposed on him. Whether one agrees with him or not, his framing effectively concedes the lex orandi, lex credendi principle from the opposite direction. If the theology changed, the liturgy had to change with it, and if the older liturgy remains, it will keep transmitting the older theology regardless of what documents say. That is a genuinely coherent internal logic, whatever one makes of its premises. Father Lawrence and those writing in similar terms this past week take that same principle and run it toward the opposite conclusion. If the liturgy shapes belief, they argue, then the sustained and multi-decade effort to restrict, relocate, and gradually reduce access to the older liturgical form is not merely an administrative preference about which rite is more pastorally effective. It functions, in their reading, as an effort to manage what future generations of Catholics will actually come to believe by managing what they are permitted to pray. That is a serious argument. It is also, again, an interpretation of intent behind a set of policy decisions, not a documented statement of purpose from the officials making those decisions. Cardinal Roche and the Dicastery for Divine Worship have offered their own stated rationale, centered on liturgical unity and pastoral concern about division. And that stated rationale deserves to be represented alongside the traditionalist reading rather than displaced by it. There is a further claim circulating in this same body of commentary worth naming directly because it deserves scrutiny rather than repetition. The assertion that today, functionally, no one is treated as a heretic or schismatic within the Church, except defenders of liturgical tradition. This is offered as a rhetorical observation rather than a documented finding, and it does not hold up well under close examination. Multiple bishops' conferences, including the German bishops during the Synodal Way process, faced direct and public correction from Rome, including interventions from Cardinal Parolin specifically blocking the proposed Synodal Council structure, as this channel has covered previously. Individual theologians and clergy promoting positions well outside settled Catholic teaching have, in various documented instances, faced disciplinary action, removal from teaching positions, or public correction. The claim that literally no one but traditionalists faces consequences is an overstatement that a fair-minded viewer should recognize as rhetorical emphasis rather than an accurate inventory of recent church discipline. The more defensible and narrower version of the complaint, that traditionalists have faced disciplinary consequences with unusual speed and severity relative to some other cases this channel has documented, including the China episcopal appointments and the German synodal way's slower and more negotiated treatment, is a fair point worth making on its own terms, without inflating it into an absolute claim that collapses under scrutiny. What can be said with confidence, pulling all of this together, is the following. Father Lawrence has raised a specific and answerable question. Is there a single, consistent, publicly articulable standard governing recent decisions from the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith across Amoris Laetitia, Fiducia Supplicans, and the SPX excommunication decree? Or does each decision rest on its own distinct and separately defensible rationale that only appears inconsistent when placed side by side, out of context? That is a legitimate theological and canonical question, and it deserves a real answer from those with the authority and expertise to give one, not dismissal simply because of who is asking it. What cannot be said with confidence, based on what has actually been published, is that this pattern reflects deliberate, coordinated infiltration by any specific movement or ideology operating covertly within church leadership. That claim remains, at this point, an interpretation offered by specific commentators within a specific tradition of Catholic descent, not something independently established. And what deserves to be set aside entirely, regardless of one's sympathies in this broader debate, is personal characterization of Cardinal Fernandez's worth or motives based on decades-old published writing, offered as though it settles a canonical question about the validity or justice of a 2026 decree. The books exist, they are publicly documented. What they say about Fernandez's judgment as a young priest and theologian is a fair subject for critical commentary. What they do or do not say about the canonical soundness of a decree he signed decades later as a cardinal is a separate question entirely. And conflating the two does not strengthen the argument. It weakens it by inviting exactly the kind of personal animus that makes the more substantive, institutional consistency question easier to dismiss. The three things worth watching from Part 1 still stand. Whether Fernandez's dicastery responds to the specific consistency argument. Whether independent canonists and theologians, including some without any stake in the SSPX's own canonical position, take up the narrower version of that same question. And whether Father Lawrence's biographical claims about Fernandez become part of a wider Catholic media conversation, or remain confined to outlets already sympathetic to his conclusions. Those three signals, tracked over the coming weeks, will tell you considerably more about where this actually stands than any single article, including this one, can tell you today. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.